Okay, so as mentioned, I'm Lisa Cliff with Better Futures Australia, and I'd like to begin our gathering by acknowledging we're each joining this call from First Nations land. For me, I have the privilege of joining from Meanjin on Yagara and Turrbal country here in beautiful Brisbane, and I pay my deep respects to elders past and present. I'm thankful for their wisdom in looking after country so that we may continue to enjoy the benefits of their labour today. May we live up to the example they have set in continuing to care for country that we now call home. I invite each of you calling in to acknowledge all the various countries you're joining from today. Before introducing our three excellent panelists to get the conversation started, I'd like to firstly just share a quick introduction to those of you on the call new to Better Futures Australia. We are a non-partisan alliance of climate champions from every sector of society and the economy who are demonstrating readiness to work with the new government to over-deliver on Australia's climate commitments. We are privileged to work with a range of sector working group partners to reach consensus on different approaches and solutions to climate change. The National Better Futures Forum, set for the 6th and 7th of September as part of the second parliamentary sitting week in Canberra, will be an opportunity to set an ambitious national climate agenda that puts us on track for a climate resilient zero emissions future. This policy dialogue is one of a series that Better Futures has been running to build an understanding around critical conversations and collaborative actions that are needed to see the government's climate commitments delivered. I would like to thank the interns, the volunteers, and the partners around assembling information and bringing together the key stakeholders for discussions like this one. So today we have three inspiring individuals joining us, and Maggie Woods from Western Australian Conservation Council unfortunately sends her apologies. A huge thank you to our three speakers today for taking the time out to be part of this conversation with us all. We have Dr. Stuart Blanch, the Senior Manager of Land Clearing and Restoration at WWF-Australia, Steve Gawler, the Regional Manager at ICLEI, the Local Governments for Sustainability Oceania, and Liam Walsh is System Lead Food, Land and Oceans at ClimateWorks Centre. There's many leading voices on this topic and a lot of wisdom for all of us to learn, particularly from our First Nations colleagues, and we will continue these conversations beyond today and hopefully bring in more voices going forward. Following a short update from each of our speakers, we'll have around 20 minutes for questions and discussion. So please do post any questions in the chat as we go, and we'll aim to round off today's webinar at 1 o'clock, and if you need to leave early, we'll have the recording up on the website following this event. So to get us started, we have Dr. Stuart Blanch on the call. Stuart has extensive knowledge and experience in environmental conservation and restoration. Along with his current role, Stuart is also a director of the Forest Stewardship Council of Australia. He has a PhD in aquatic plant ecology from the University of Adelaide and a master's in environmental law. Stu's dad was a banana farmer and Stu feels that he's still doing penance for all the land clearing from the history of his family. So working hard out there to try and repair some of that damage. Thanks, Stu, for joining us.
Thank you, Lisa. And perhaps I should have seen if my dad's watching this call before I said that. But anyway, thank you. I'm on a Wabakal country in Newcastle. I want to thank Better Futures Australia for the great work you do. It really is very, very important, the work you do. So I'm very happy to support and contribute. I'm going to talk a bit about some of the high level policy stuff that WWF works on that relates to nature-based solutions for climate change, and I'm happy to take questions. So firstly, a lot of the work we do is covered by our Towards 2 Billion Trees vision, which has a goal of saving and growing 2 billion trees across Australia by 2030. This is part of our Regenerate Australia vision, and it fits within the global Trillion Trees initiative led by WWF, the World Conservation Society, WCS, and BirdLife International. And this really is about bringing to an end the land clearing and logging wars that have been raging for 50 years, and bringing together the key solution providers to land carbon and nature-based solutions across most of Australia, which is graziers, farmers and Indigenous communities, and conservation and climate organisations, and often and still there is a lot of difference of views between our groups. So broadly, the transition, which is largely complete, but not completely completed, from major deforestation to reforestation, and from native forest logging to plantations and highly certified selective native forest logging. I think that's the great challenge of this decade. Think about the issues that Tanya Plibersek mentioned in her press club launch last week, announcing the State of the Environment report. She cast her role as in the shadow of big major commitments by Labor prime ministers and governments in the past about protected areas, Great Barrier Reef. I think also in terms of water in the Murray-Darling Basin and climate in terms of renewables, I think this decade, particularly when looking forward to 2030, ending the war on trees and helping farmers and graziers and Indigenous communities, regional Australia, benefit from more trees, not less. That really is, I think, a holy grail for addressing the nature and climate crisis this decade. That's going to require natural capital markets, carbon and biodiversity markets, major new government funding, which is difficult when there are so many budget deficits because of COVID, and supporting landowners who produce products to access supply chains where deforestation-free and carbon-positive products will increasingly be rewarded and other products shut out of trade supply chains. The Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forest and Land Use, if you haven't read it, I'll drop all these links in the chat afterwards. Very, very significant in terms of Australia signed on, along with, I think, perhaps maybe 100 other countries, looking to halt and reverse forest loss by 2030. This is a new paradigm. Australia's never signed on to these sorts of voluntary global commitments around trees before. It relates to forests and woodlands, of course, protecting, regenerating, revegetating, planting trees, but also grasslands, shrublands, wetlands, etc. And it's really very significant that Glasgow Leaders Declaration, it was announced at COP26, the climate COP, not COP15, the biodiversity COP, which will happen later on this year in Montreal. So for the first time, forests and other natural ecosystems, marine and terrestrial, are clearly seen as a nature-based solution to our pressing climate and nature-based and nature crises. Very, very significant. Thirdly, 30 by 30, the global goal to protect 30% of land and seas by 2030. The Australian government, both Coalition and Labor, are committed to it broadly, and Labor is also committed to it domestically. It means protecting another 77 to more than 100 million hectares by 2030 on land in Australia. It's an enormous, enormous amount of area. Protected and conserved areas need to be part of the solution to the climate and nature crises. WWF's done some modelling. We cost that at about $4 billion, so significant, but we think it could generate $29 billion in carbon sink value this decade. They will have to address Indigenous protected areas, covenants on working farms, buying land back to create national parks or private wildlife reserves, retiring state forest logging. It's very significant, and that's the scale of intervention we need. How it works, all that has to be worked out, but it's a great goal and we're very supportive. Fourthly, the nature-based solutions that WWF is supporting in the Pacific and Southeast Asia, thanks to funding from DFAT, it's a new program and it's supporting local communities in the Pacific Islands, particularly to find equitable nature-based solutions to climate change in the Pacific and Southeast Asia. These solutions work most effectively when they draw on the knowledge and support of local communities and their aspirations. It's got to be community-led, and we partner with groups like Save the Children and other international NGOs to make these happen. Good example in Papua New Guinea and Solomons, we're supporting Save the Children to develop sustainable and inclusive livelihoods. So, for example, honey production to carbon credits. And that's supporting and incentivizing local communities to benefit from protecting and restoring ecosystems to both mitigate and adapt to climate change. I'll leave it there. I'll drop some other information in the chat, including the Climate Resilient by Nature website, which has got great information about the work being done in Asia Pacific. Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks so much, Stuart. So no questions in so far. Please do we did have an issue with the chat, but it has been reactivated, so you should be able to post any comments or questions in there now. Apologies for that. I have no idea how I managed to break Zoom like that. But yeah, should all be working. Please do let me know if not, and we'll get back to fixing that. Next, we will be hearing from Steve Gawler, the Regional Manager of ICLEI, the Local Governments for Sustainability, Oceania. As part of Steve's role at ICLEI, he also manages their Cities and Nature program. The Urban Nature-Based Solutions is a large part of that program as they seek to tackle urban, environmental and social issues with nature. And Steve also shared before today's webinar that they're at the point of being approved for a project in Kiribati looking at seaweed farming for carbon sequestration. So lots of exciting work underway, not just in Australia, but across Oceania and the region. Thanks, Steve, for joining us today.
Thanks, Lisa. Hi, everyone. How are you? I've got to also talk about my background a little bit, which was in rural Victoria, living on farms. So yeah, look, I share some of the guilt as well for both grazing farms and also orchards on the outskirts of Melbourne. I'm sure we've did our best to devastate the environment 100 years ago. So that must be that shared guilt that we all feel. As Lisa said, we focus on the work of local governments and sustainable development. We have a very strong urban focus. So I think my comments this morning are going to be mainly about nature-based solutions in an urban context. Just to be clear, and I think we're all finding that the term nature-based solutions means very different things to different people. We certainly look at that as being both blue and green infrastructure. And we look at it as being just as importantly about biodiversity as about just, mass greening. So I think in local government, the standard understanding of nature-based solution is plant more trees, which is of course hugely valuable, but equally we need to look at permeability of the surface of properties in cities, cutting down on urban heat island effect, wind tunnel effects, boosting local biodiversity. So we have a very broad definition of nature-based solutions. Most councils in Australia now get the importance of trying to restore their ecosystems within the city limits, but there are huge problems and barriers as to how they're going to go about that. So I thought that it might be useful this morning if I talked about a little bit of recent research that we've done. And we partnered up with Swinburne University here in Melbourne. We interviewed 22 councils from around Australia, big and small, suburban, peri-urban and provincial. And they were very structured and in-depth interviews asking, how are you going with your nature-based program? What are your achievements so far? What are your aspirations? What are the barriers? Where do you need support? So we got a very good analysis of the state of play. And just for this morning, I've pulled out 3 of the big issues that a lot of urban nature practitioners highlighted to us. And there was quite an amazing consistency of feedback, which is, it makes it a lot easier for us to tackle the big issues if everyone's telling us fairly similar stories. So in no particular order, 3 of the big issues that came up was firstly just statutory planning, planning controls, council's role in approving new developments, and the capacity of councils to ensure that new developments include green space, permeable surfaces, planting of trees, etc. And that's in the context of most of our cities now are experiencing infill development, much higher density. We've got some really dramatic and sort of heartbreaking aerial photographs of areas 20 years ago and the amount of canopy cover, and now that a quarter-acre block has been divided up and turned into 4 townhouses. So how can councils ensure that new developments still have a reasonable amount of green space and permeability? The issue for most councils is that they're often quite constrained by state government planning systems. And councils generally can't just make a unilateral change so that they can ensure that every new development has at least 15% open space. That's usually beyond the capacity of councils, and it needs to be handled at a state government level. And an interesting case study is the city of Untitled in South Australia, who's lobbying their state government very hard for exactly that power. And evidently they're at the point now of reaching agreement, and it would be a bilateral agreement from the state system, so supported by both parties. So councils can really take a leadership role in this. And that's the regulatory approach. But the other side to the same story is, what's the capacity of councils to actually incentivise private property owners to, it could be to retain significant foliage and trees, or it could be to replant. And there are lots of good ideas around, but once again, it sometimes is constrained by the Local Government Act. Councils can't necessarily use their rating system to penalise or incentivise. So there's a lot of policy stuff around councils' ability to try to drive, renewed urban greening. That's the first one that I wanted to highlight. The second one is, I'm not sure it's a policy issue, but it's one that really exercises my mind, because back when I was a local government manager for some years, I was responsible for risk management, and risk management has become a terribly important part of prudent management within local governments. And the urban nature practitioners often bump up against very, very rigid risk reduction policies and procedures. Simple examples is simply tree planting along roadways. And I think we all know that there's a lot of pushback on that because they're a hazard. Trees are a hazard in the cities. You might even trip up, or it might cause a blockage of a view line. And it seems to almost have reached the point where risk management is so predominant now in council planning that we're in danger of creating very safe but very sterile cities. And there is a need to get some sort of a balance back where we can live with nature, albeit in a fairly high density urban environment, accept some of the risk and take some responsibility ourselves to manage that risk, and whether it's a motorist or a pedestrian or a property owner, and try to get that balance back within council planning and financing. It's sort of typified by the poor old urban forest manager bumping up against the infrastructure manager and the risk manager within a council. And often it's the green section that loses out on that fight. So some sort of a balance there. Now, there could be some policy issues here, particularly with the insurance industry, because obviously insurers will be pushing very hard to minimise their risk, their exposure, but there needs to be a balance. And the third one I want to talk about, it's quite interesting. Another very common cry from a lot of city nature planners is that natural assets, green and blue assets, are not being valued appropriately by councils and by governments. They're not being treated as a serious asset class, and therefore it's not possible, or it's quite difficult to attach financial value to the benefit of investing in greater tree planting, for instance, or the loss, the actual dollar value of the loss which would be represented by clearing trees. And this means that, the annual budget cycle for councils, all the managers put up their budget proposals, they all go into the mixing pot, get weighed up and put to the council for approval. And it's quite hard for nature planners to put up a solid, financially evidenced business case for high levels of investment in nature, because they haven't got that sort of background of valuation of assets, maintaining asset registers. Councils aren't at this stage required to manage their natural assets the way they do their hard infrastructure, and having asset renewal plans and having maintenance plans which are properly resourced. So, we plant a lot of trees and then they're not properly maintained. There's a lot of dieback, and then they've got to go begging back to the council for more funds to replace them. So that's the third one I wanted to raise, just the need for local government, state governments, probably federal government, to value green assets in the same way that we value hard assets. So look, there's some ideas to kick it off, very much from a local government perspective and from an urban nature perspective. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Steve. And yeah, I think your point around finding balance is something we all grapple with every day and working in the climate space. So thank you for that. Next up, we have with us Liam Walsh, the systems lead of Food, Land and Oceans at ClimateWorks Centre. Liam has a diverse background in the global food systems, including the United Nations. He's currently leading ClimateWorks' efforts to reduce emissions within food, land and ocean systems across Australia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. Fun fact about Liam is he was born on the continent of Africa and has had many years of experience working in different countries across that continent. So he's back in Australia now working with us and brings a lot of wisdom for how things work overseas. So thanks for joining us today, Liam.
Great, thank you, Lisa, and hello everyone. Really happy to be with you all today. So first of all, just wanted to explain that I work for an organization called ClimateWorks Centre. Hopefully most of you on the call today will be familiar with the organization, but we're an organization based in the Monash Sustainable Development Institute at Monash University, with a focus on accelerating the transition to net zero. And we do this by bridging the gap between research and action. And as Lisa said, I'm the system lead for food, land and oceans. So focus of my work is really on what we can do to reduce emissions associated with the way we use our land and our oceans, as well as what we can do to enhance sinks of greenhouse gas emissions through ecosystem stewardship and improvements in agriculture. Today, I'm going to talk about some of the things that I feel are important if we are to adopt nature-based solutions in a variety of ways across Australia. I'm not going to talk about the specific policy measures that are needed at this stage, and instead focus on some broad areas where we may need common agreement on nature-based solutions moving forward, particularly amongst the Better Futures community. The first thing to say is that at ClimateWorks Centre, we feel that nature-based solutions are an essential contributor on the journey to net zero. We know that we can't achieve net zero without nature. Even if we do reduce emissions at the scale that's needed, we'll still be left with having to draw down the carbon that currently exists in the atmosphere. And at present, nature is our greatest carbon sink. Nature-based solutions can provide a sustainable, cost-effective, multi-purpose and flexible approach in support of reaching this goal of net zero. So there's good reason to be enthusiastic and really supportive of these different solutions. At the same time, their potential contribution to net zero should not be overstated. Nature-based solutions are not a substitute for rapid decarbonisation of all sectors of the economy. So it's essential that this enthusiasm for these particular solutions does not distract from the urgent need to rapidly decarbonise our economy. Now, if we're going to fully realise the potential for nature-based solutions across Australia, there are a few areas that I would highlight that we will need to address in the immediate term, particularly as a Better Futures community. The first is that we need clear definitions and principles that underpin the rollout of nature-based solutions in Australia. There's still quite significant debates on the scope and types of interventions that can be classified as nature-based solutions. I think we're all familiar with, the wider definition, actions to protect, sustainably manage, and restore ecosystems that provide benefits to society. But these definitions are still quite general and a bit blurry and often fail to indicate, which solutions can be regarded as nature-based solutions. And I think if you look at the agriculture space in particular, there are some good examples there where some proponents might include practices such as, minimum tillage or improved crop rotations as examples of nature-based solutions, whilst other people won't. And whilst talking about definitions might seem a little bit dry, these definitions do matter because they have a direct impact on really the evidence pertaining to actual and potential carbon sequestration and storage across these different areas. And clear definitions are also going to help in understanding the contribution that nature-based solutions have to our climate and biodiversity targets, which is a really important element. I also think that it's important that we have a clear set of principles that should underpin the rollout of nature-based solution. Principles are particularly important if we're going to avoid some of the pitfalls associated with having either too narrow a view on nature-based solutions or perhaps an unrealistic view of their potential. So, for example, different nature-based solutions vary in the extent to which they support biodiversity. We know that fast-growing monocultures can sequester carbon rapidly and potentially deliver on some climate goals in the short term. However, we also know that some plantations may become invasive. They could introduce new pests and diseases or exacerbate water scarcity in the region. So one example of a principle might be that nature-based solutions should involve a wide range of ecosystems on land and the sea, and not just sort of tree planting. Another example might be that nature-based solutions should be designed and implemented in partnership with local communities and stakeholders. There are already examples of these principles that are emerging in different parts of the world. And so again, it's important that we as a community have a shared view on what these look like in Australia. The other point I want to make is, there's a need for a realistic understanding of the technical potential of different nature-based solutions and how they might deliver against climate and nature targets. There are still large gaps in evidence. There is still sort of significant scientific uncertainties in, how much carbon can be stored in certain habitats, sort of how long it could be sequestered in future. And so we're going to have to sort of think about how we address some of those gaps in knowledge. Of course, having said that, we can't wait until we have this deep understanding of each solution before we act. And there are clearly some no regrets options, such as avoided deforestation that was highlighted earlier, that just need to happen. But it is important that we fill these knowledge gaps and build more consistency in how we measure the success of these solutions, and that we acknowledge some of the uncertainties. And the final point I wanted to make is that nature-based solutions need to be considered in the context of broader planning. Our land and ocean resources are finite, and therefore decisions need to be made about the allocation and use of resources for different purposes. And some of these decisions may involve trade-offs. There's a need for the management and implementation of nature-based solutions across multiple jurisdictions. And this currently happens across multiple government departments and at present without an overarching strategy. And so we need an understanding of how nature-based solutions will be delivered across different jurisdictions in a coordinated manner by the different government entities that may be responsible for ultimately supporting them. And just to sort of add a final point on that, again, I think the role of Indigenous people within that planning process is really crucial if we're going to deliver effective, resilient, legitimate and equitable outcomes. And this is, not just sort of a moral and ethical imperative, it is really going to underpin the success of nature-based solutions moving forward. So there's a couple of points to share, and looking forward to receiving some questions. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Liam. I'll bring us all back. We've got a few questions coming in. So that was just some really great insights from different areas where there's a lot of great work underway. So thank you to all of you for all you're doing in this very important space. And yeah, Liam, you really tied it up nicely at the end, just pointing to the need for those shared understandings, shared definitions, a national framework and standards with, that's what we're hearing from some of the Better Futures members in the business community and local councils, that really, there's a lot of different structures and rules to play by. So there's a real desire there to have some standards in place and know what everything means for everyone in different parts of this beautiful country. So we've got a few questions that follow on nicely from the planning points from Steve, that also raised by Steve, that also fed into some points you mentioned there, Liam, and also going back to your points, Stu, to open the discussion around the need for the national approaches for nature-based solutions to climate change generally, with clear definitions and principles. So I feel like that all kind of translates down to some shared responses from these. So I might throw back to the order of Stu, Steve and Liam to just respond to these. So we've got a question from Tom Rivard around how do we transform our mindset from jobs and growth to one to degrowth, regeneration and coexistence, with regards to the planning policy being one of the biggest dangers to the environment. And that kind of connects to the question that was also directed to Steve around the Queensland Built Environment's adaptation plan, mentioning green spaces, the built environment professionals not valuing nature-based solutions, So how can we incorporate more of an understanding of the value of nature-based solutions into those national adaptation resilience type strategies, or state-based if it's in the context of Queensland? So I'll throw that back to you, Stu, to kick us off.
Okay, well, I'm not going to try to answer all that, Lisa. It's a really good question, but I'll leave time for Steve and Liam. In terms of national leadership, it's I think now compared to 10 or 20 years ago, when in terms of nature, it was often seen as fossil fuel phase out versus tree planting. In terms of Paris Agreement and the Glasgow Climate Pact, it's very clear that we need to do both at the same time, and planting trees or reducing land clearing is not a license for the fossil fuel industries to have another 10 or 20 years of expansion or continued production. We can't afford it, us and the world. So it's both at the same time. There's important work to be done on high integrity offsets. There's often a broad range of views on where these fit and should there be offsetting between geogenic and biogenic carbon. There's a lot of papers written on that, a lot of views. I think in terms of getting to 40% and well above by 2030, it's hard for me to see how there can be major land clearing or logging and not, 10 million hectares plus restoration targets to lift our ambition, our NDC to consistent with a 1.5 degree pathway. So I think it clarifies it now. So I think it's easier, and the election reveals that there's a vast majority of Australians want climate action. But I think it's also clear that if we want people in the bush, in regional and rural Australia, to help store and save carbon on the land, we can no longer ask them to do it or just regulate them and with no money. We've put tens of billions of dollars as taxpayers through governments on the table for subsidising renewables. For example, rooftop solar, great, absolutely needed. John Howard put $10 billion on the table more than 15 years ago to try to fix up the Murray-Darling Basin. I think it's that scale of public sector investment in it. If it doesn't have a $10 billion in front of it on trees this decade, I really don't think we're serious. It needs to be that scale of investment, maybe more. I think the question is, how much is public funds, including federal government funding and state, local government funding, versus private funding, philanthropic, or rewarding landowners who like produce beef or wood and sell it into markets which will increasingly demand forest and carbon risk to be removed from those supply chains. So one, national leadership, again, addressing mitigation and adaptation. And some of those good things we had 10, 15 years ago, again, about national adaptation for climate resilience flagships. Maybe we need to resurrect some of those. I think it really is a partnership between like the bush and the city, between conservation and climate groups, farmers, graziers, Indigenous organisations, about what is a transition that allows people to make money and create jobs managing their land and restoring it. And we have to end the tree wars to have those discussions. And it's hard to have those discussions because trust has been eroded over decades. And I've been part of the war. So to have those discussions is really challenging.
Thanks, Stu. Steve, would you like to add to that?
Yes, thanks, Lisa. I'm just looking at the questions. Thank you very much for the questions. They're really making my head work hard here. So Amy's question about valuation of green assets and whether starting with a natural capital accounting approach rather than a financial approach might be a good start. I think that was the point of your question. But I'd be fairly worried about that. I'm a former local government manager, and I've been through many annual council budgeting processes. And unfortunately, until we can, in my opinion, until we can start to attach quite hard dollar values to assets, all asset classes, they'll never match up in the bidding war, which is typical of council budgeting, and therefore where council will put its investments. And, the point that Stuart made just now about needing big investments, it applies equally to how the councils spend their budgets. Look, there is good work being done. There's been work done on this for 20 years. There was a former ICLEI program called Eco Budget, which was a European program which tried to put euro values against all natural assets. Liam's own organisation ClimateWorks Monash Sustainable Development Institute. I think the head of the institute is part of a European initiative called Naturevation, which is trying to do exactly this, work out reliable ways to attach financial value, or economic value. So, you know, my feeling is while the natural capital accounting is important for helping us to understand general value, it would never really stand up in a local government investment decision type context. That's my opinion. Secondly, from Mr. Anonymous or Miss Anonymous about the Queensland built environment sector not recognising value of green spaces and an update to the National Adaptation Resilience Strategy. Again, I'm not really convinced. I mean, I reread the national strategy recently, and it's very good, broad brush, all the principles, all the things that need to be considered. But it's almost the same as my previous response, I think, until the importance of nature, natural assets penetrates through to the real, you know, the real treasury of our governments and is seriously considered at that level. I don't think sitting in a climate change strategy somewhere is going to do it. But the problem you've identified there, that's absolutely characteristic of the lack of awareness right now of the importance of natural assets, blue-green assets. And the traditional owners, just a quick word about that, certainly another very strong finding from the research that we did with those 22 councils. I would say almost every respondent that we spoke with was very, very concerned about the fact that they still don't know how best to work with their First Nations communities. They absolutely get the importance of it. They absolutely get the importance of co-designing from step one with their traditional owners rather than coming up with a plan to create some sort of natural system or assets and then going and consulting. That's no good. It's not just about identifying a location for some sort of natural installation and then checking that it's not a sensitive cultural area. It's much more about right from square one. How do we start the conversation and how are the First Nations people equal partners in the design process? So that's really just a huge need. I'm aware of one guide that's been recently prepared by the Melbourne University Clean Air and Urban Landscapes Hub, which is no longer operating, which I think is going to be rolled out fairly soon, and ICLEI is hoping to participate in that and make that available to our councils. That's probably enough for starters. Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks, Steve. And we've had more comments coming in. And yeah, if you wanted to also speak to the importance of including traditional owners in the planning elements there, Liam, with the questions around the issues with planning and development approvals generally, and what role national or state-based standards and strategies might play. Thanks, Liam. Thanks for all the questions, everyone.
Yeah, I mean, just to say, as I said before, I think with nature-based solutions, if we want them to be effective, if we want them to be resilient and legitimate, then it is essential that we, you know, involve a range of stakeholders in the design and implementation of them, particularly Indigenous peoples. Ultimately, I think that engagement is really going to underpin the success of some of these nature-based solutions and their implementation moving forward. If we create a situation where, you know, we simply have, you know, all of this being implemented by external experts that sort of undermine or ignore local knowledge, this could really result in poor and ineffective land management decisions being made. So it's really important that any of these sort of nature-based solutions and projects really have that sort of social license to operate, and that the views of Indigenous peoples are well and truly sort of part of that decision-making process.
Thanks, Liam. We've got about 15 more minutes of this webinar, so I'll see how we go with this. But Amy's comment there and Renee's response, I think, is maybe the prompt for a question around our intent of the Better Futures Forum on the 6th and 7th of September to bring diverse stakeholders together to explore cross-sectoral collaboration opportunities and ways that community leaders, subnational governments and business leaders can work with the new government to deliver on their climate commitments in this first term of government. So a question to each of you, if you were to prioritise 1 or 2 steps you would suggest to maybe a business leader or a local council or a community organisation that's looking to you for advice, what's that step that you would recommend they take in the next 6 months to progress nature-based solutions in this term of government? Starting with you, Stu.
If they are, it depends a bit on the sector, but I think if they've got the capacity to be involved in processes that help them think and learn from their peers, the Science-Based Targets Initiative in terms of climate and nature, that's useful. Look at the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. If they're big companies and they're going to be caught, or they're entities that must report to the stock exchange or to investors, that will provide support to those companies to work out what they need to do and learn from others who are doing this, because everyone's largely in the same boat. I think that's important. In terms of the question, I think it might have been from Amy to Steve in terms of natural capital accounting. There are not many examples I know of that seem to be really try to put dollar values on the ground in terms of blue or green nature. So it's challenging. I was pretty impressed by the natural capital accounts developed by Foraco, which is a subsidiary of New Forests. So they are a plantation operator in Tasmania that developed a natural capital account. So I think they're in their 2nd year now. A lot of organisations looking to them, and they put dollar values on both their commercial harvesting and plantations and on their about 50,000 hectares of natural forest that they don't log, but they estimate the natural capital values. I would look at that. Certainly others would say the System of Environmental Economic Accounts, the SEA from the UN, has got merit, and it has been important at a state scale, for example, in helping the Victorian government to commit to phasing out logging, including to protect water supply for Melbourne. At the local government or smaller company scale, I'm not sure I can help as much on that, but rest assured, you're not the only one thinking about this. There are a lot of examples, and don't start from scratch. Look at what others have done and build on them and stand on their shoulders. Thanks, Liz.
Thanks, Stu. Steve.
Oh, thank you. That was a big question. Look, I reckon the last 6 or so weeks of the new Australian government, we've been hearing a lot from Chris Bowen, and we're now starting to hear more from Tanya Plibersek. And the reason for that is that the world is facing a climate crisis and a biodiversity extinction crisis. And at the very highest level, you've got the IP BEST report that came out a year or so back. We've got the regular IPCC assessments. So we've got globally endorsed reports on the scale of those crises. And I reckon that is now really hitting home with our new government. And I think at every level, whether it's high government level down to local government level down to community, it's linking the two, which is going to be most powerful, which sort of half answers Rosie's question that I've just seen in the chat about ways of shifting policies and priorities towards nature-based planning. I think it's happening. We're seeing across Australia many more green, young, usually female councillors being elected to councils, and that's shifting the whole dynamic. And it's community pressure. It's also doing exactly what BFA does, which is bringing in the business sector. Local governments need to have very strong relationships with their local traders and manufacturers, and always linking those to the climate crisis and the biodiversity extinction crisis. I think now it's more a question of how and what do we do, not whether we should do it.
I'll jump in there, Lisa. So if I was to answer that question, particularly on behalf of a major business that was thinking about nature-based solutions and its role, for companies that are thinking about nature-based solutions and how they might deploy them either in their own operations or in their supply chains with some of their suppliers and partners, I think one of the things that I would encourage is that they lean into and start to learn more about the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. which a lot of stakeholders in Australia are becoming a bit more aware of at this point in time. For those that haven't heard about this, this is a framework that's being developed to ultimately deliver a risk management and disclosure sort of framework for organizations to report on and act on sort of their evolving nature-related risks. And this particular framework is following on from the Task Force for Climate-Related Disclosure, which has had sort of ultimately a lot of success in driving action in major businesses. And the hope moving forward is that the Task Force of Nature-Related Financial Disclosures will help deliver on some of what has taken place in the climate space as well. So yeah, I will also pop the link to that in the chat, but I think sort of embracing that process, that TNFD process, and starting to understand how you can measure your impacts and dependencies on nature, I think is going to be sort of a crucial first step for a lot of large businesses in particular. And yeah, and then also Stuart made mention of the Science-Based Targets Initiative as well, which is also another one that's sort of linked with that Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure.
Thank you all. That was a great response and lots of great ideas there to build on in the forum discussions in September. There's also a comment here from Murray where he mentions the difficulties in finding the appropriate advice and information for strengthening the resilience to climate change in part of the regenerating landscapes and country process generally. And this is a big topic at the moment, particularly following the devastating fires and floods that have hit large parts of Australia in the last couple of years. And we're likely to see more of that with increasing frequency of intense rainfall events and other challenges that a warmer atmosphere brings. So there will be a session with the support of researchers from UNSW at the Better Futures Forum on strengthening community resilience and the elements of fire and flood. So maybe a final note from each of you on nature-based solutions and where you think there's opportunities to both deliver the mitigation solutions and maybe increase the resilience of those communities facing those impacts. Stu.
It was hard going first. You got to think as you sit and talk. I think, as I put in the chat, the transition out of land clearing and logging based on federal government carbon account data, that would yield about 75 million tonnes a year abatement. I think that's in addition to the 43%, although I haven't checked the commitment that's used to model the Powering Australia commitment by the federal government. That cannot happen and should not happen without a lot of money going to landowners who will be affected, because it is taking away constitutional, sometimes constitutional, legal, and in their views, moral rights to clear land. We want a peace deal with the bush, including traditional owners who are in those communities. We in the city have got to pay them fair dinkum money, not just want to regulate them. It will never stick. So I think that would deliver another 13% of emissions abatement if that was done, and that excludes sequestration benefits. So at that scale of national outcomes of things of a decade plus scale impact, you'd need a shared position and policy stability. And maybe with the 43% legislative target, if that gets up, and the commitment to ratchet up the NDC, the land sector would come into its own more so in terms of not just allowing fossil fuel expansion to continue as it has for the last 20 years, but to actually significantly reduce emissions and build resilience in landscapes. That would be the one thing I think is the holy grail of land sector emissions management, tree management this decade.
Thanks, Stu. Steve.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm equipped to answer that question. It was too difficult. I'll have a go though. I think that one of my observations over the last probably 20 years is that when most people have talked about addressing climate change, we've talked about reducing emissions, and that's where, of course, this country got totally stuck. And the need to adapt to climate impacts which are already happening and prepare for future climate impacts, which we sort of normally refer to as adaptation, was always a bit second best, and it came along several years later and it never quite got either the attention or the investment that was required. And then more recently, of course, the R word has become all powerful, the resilience. And we've even now got a National Recovery and Resilience Agency. But I don't think we really understand yet fully about resilience and what climate resilience means, and also how that links with other forms of urban resilience. And I'm talking cities predominantly. And I think there needs to be a lot of work done on that. Ultimately, what we want is an integrated approach to tackling climate, which is obviously curbing global warming, transitioning to renewables, and being well prepared and resilient for whatever hits us in the future. But I think so far, yeah, I think the resilience side has been undercooked. Our organisation is doing a lot of work on that right now, both in Australia and the islands. So for my money, that's where there needs to be a priority. Thank you.
The only thing I would add to that, Lisa, is I think that, if I'm honest, I think we spend a lot of time thinking about how nature basin solutions will deliver on some of the ambition that government has in terms of meeting climate targets, biodiversity targets, thinking about some of the ways in which nature-based solutions will help deliver on some of the ambition in major corporations and businesses, and perhaps a bit more sort of thought needs to be given to sort of just how, the deployment of these particular solutions are actually going to support communities on the ground in a direct fashion. So it feels like that's an area, particularly with the upcoming forum that's planned in September, that might be one to explore as we move forward.
Thanks, Liam. Yeah, the question of how we incentivize and compensate as well the people out there that we're kind of putting a lot of the onus on to deliver these solutions is a difficult one to tackle, particularly in the global financial question, financial crisis question space that we're in. So I was just looking at the chat and comments on questions at the same time. Stu, your point there is definitely something to consider in these live webinars. So thank you to each of you for all of those incredibly valuable insights. Very interested in continuing these conversations and building out some of those more complex ideas to look at what a national response and what looking to working with the new government in this first term looks like to really build that shared understanding of nature-based solutions, both in the domestic and the international context that we're working in, and really bring everyone together to see how we can deliver Australia's fair share under the Paris Climate Agreement. So thank you for all you're doing. I did want to just say that there are a few sessions on the program for the Better Futures Forum on the 6th and 7th of September. Some will be looking at more of the local council approach of increasing climate resilience and adaptation, and nature-based solutions play an important role there, and others will be looking to where there's opportunities to grow nature-based solutions to mitigate Australia's impacts. There's the corporate investor angle of the global framework, some of which I think all of you mentioned different frameworks, TCFD, Science-Based Targets Initiative, and many others. ICLEI also participates in the Global Race to Zero and the Global Race to Resilience. So there's a lot of frameworks out there and a lot of different methodologies and tools that different stakeholders can participate in to take credible action and deliver emissions reductions towards our national contribution to the global carbon budget. This is the critical decade, so please do reach out. Stu did offer a conversation with you, Murray. That's great to see. And in the Better Futures Australia community, we do have a lot of expert partner organisations working on different elements, including the 3 amazing organisations you see on the call today, ClimateWorks, ICLEI, and WWF. And then there's also some working in more of the commercial space, the carbon markets, and also climate service providers in terms of helping you to develop and implement climate action plans. So if any questions, please do reach out to contact@betterfutures.org.au and be as specific as possible, and we'll try and link you to the right person in our community. Looking forward to seeing many of you in Canberra or online on the 6th and 7th of September. I'll pop the link in the chat so you've got that there. And otherwise, we'll have this recording with all of the wisdom and insights from the wonderful Stuart, Steve and Liam here today. And we'll hope to continue this conversation and bring in new perspectives and build out some of the ideas that they've pointed to for how we can scale these solutions going forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, bye-bye.